Welcome, my friends. Tonight's story is not about kings or wars, but about the slow, deep details that shaped, day after day, the life of a human being who lived thousands of years ago. Imagine yourself there, not in palaces, but on the dirt roads, in workshops, in the fields that stretched along the banks of the Nile. This story is not about the pharaohs whose names are written in gold, but about those who lived in the shadows, who ground the wheat, made bricks, and dug canals with their hands. We will not talk about the pyramids, but about the fingers of those who built them, about the feet of those who walked the streets of Thebes under the sun and slept on the cold ground. Tonight we will try to slow down time and listen to the rhythm of their lives. Imagine that you wake up with the first ray of light seeping in through an opening in the ceiling made of palm fronds. Not a clock to wake you, but the crowing of a rooster, the cry of a child, or the chirping of insects. The air is saturated with the scent of earth and the light smoke rising from a nearby clay stove. In ancient Egypt, the morning began with baking not fluffy white bread, but dark, coarse loaves made of flour. Grinded on heavy stones with cracked hands, the flour is full of sand particles. Yes, sand was part of the daily diet, entering the mouth and wearing away the teeth year after year. The woman was often the first to wake up, heating water, kneading and baking loaves to suffice for the family and perhaps enough for the worker to carry with him to his place of work. Bread was the most valuable thing produced in the home, sometimes more valuable than gold, because you did not eat it, but its need ate you. Work begins with the sun. If you were a farmer, you walked to the fields. You did not own them, but you worked them. The land belonged to the state, the temples, or the nobles, and you were merely a working hand, owning nothing but your daily sustenance. Imagine the Nile mud between your fingers, hot, sticky, almost alive. The plants did not grow on their own, but were irrigated by dug channels that you opened and closed with your arms, and you cleaned them of weeds daily. The sun was harsh, the back bent early, and the body knew it would never straighten up again. Life was not dark, but it was tiring. It was not hungry, but it was always on the edge of hunger. Bread remained the beginning and the end. When you left your small mud house, you passed between close, low houses with walls of sun-dried mud bricks. The passages were narrow, and the air was the heaviest mixture of cooking smells, sweat, and stagnant water. The basins, the sounds of life creep in from every corner: a baby's cry, the laughter of barefoot children running, an argument between a couple behind a curtain of faded linen. The walls don't speak. An event, but they know. A witness to thousands of steps, to the silence of wives and to the coughing of the elderly at night. When the weather turns cold in ancient Egypt, privacy was rare. Living in groups was a necessity, not a choice. Every house had a roof, but not everyone had time to rest under it. Craftsmen, for example, their day was divided between their skills and the orders of the state. The carpenter, the sculptor, the engraver did not work for themselves, but for projects of temples, tombs, or statues requested by the ruling class. Salaries were sometimes paid in barley, garlic, or bowls of light beer. While the state seems to have regulated work meticulously, delays in paying wages were common. Once, at Deir el-Medina near Luxor, the workers went on strike. Yes, a strike, the first documented workers' protest in history, over delays in food rations. But even in those moments, the goal was not rebellion, but living with dignity to deserve the bread you eat, for your body to return. At the end of the day, to a wall that knows your name and a ceiling that doesn't collapse on you. Behind all of this, a woman prepares dinner, mends a worn-out fabric, or tells a story to a child who is slowly falling asleep. She too worked all day in the mud, grinding, cleaning, and enduring. The house was a refuge, but it wasn't as comfortable as we think. There were no mattresses, no running water, and no glass windows, only palm frond mats, clay pots, and a chest containing the remains of patched shirts. Despite all of this, there was no feeling of poverty as we understand it today. There was fatigue, yes, but it was a shared fatigue shared by everyone. There were moments of warmth, of laughter, of soft singing near the fire of Zayd, because life, although harsh, was not without meaning. Imagine yourself walking in a small market in an ancient Egyptian city like Ekaitan or Memphis. The floor is dirt, and the temperature rises quickly with sunrise. There are no signs, no organized rows of stalls, but rather intersecting aisles, overlapping voices, and a strong smell of spices, dried fish, oil, and fermented fruits. The vendors sit on the ground, in front of baskets of vegetables or pottery vessels filled with honey or local wine. A woman displays bracelets made of colored beads, and a child chases a rooster running away between the legs. No metal currency is often used, but rather a barter system. A loaf of bread for a handful of onions, or a bowl of butter for a piece of cloth. Trade is not just an exchange. It is negotiation, experience, and knowledge of the value of things in a world where prices are not read on a card, but on the faces of people. The rich do not come to the market often. They buy in bulk through agents, while the common people know the faces of the sellers and know who is good at cheating and who swears by the gods to sell a broken egg. In one of the corners you find an old man selling wheat. His complexion is tanned by the sun, and his back is bent from years of sitting. He doesn't raise his voice, just looks at the customers with wise eyes, as if he reads their intentions before they speak. Near him, a woman sells the remains of yesterday's bread, covered with a piece of linen that protects it from flies more than dust. Nothing is thrown away here without benefit. Even the ash from the ovens is used for cleaning or in cosmetics. It is an economic life in essence, where there is no room for luxuries and no time for waste. But the market is not just a place to buy, it is a center for communication. Women exchange news. Men talk about the coming Nile flood, or about news of the employees in the temple, or about what they heard from another city. There is always someone telling a story, reciting poetry, or reading a piece of papyrus written by a writer who aspires to be something greater. The noise in the market is not loud, but a hidden, regular rhythm, like the pulse of a city living on the edges of need. When the sun begins to decline, the crowding dwindles and faces begin to change. Older women appear, buying what cheap vegetables are left, or men who have finished their work and want something to tide them over until morning. At these moments, before the ovens go out and the wooden doors close, people return to their homes laden with needs and with the stories of the day. The market is not a place, but a mirror that reflects what is grown, what is thought, what is feared, and what is desired. We will not talk here about Ramses, Amenhotep, or Akhenaten. Let us imagine an unknown man with no statue, no decorated tomb, no preserved record. A young man of 10 years old working as a brickmaker on the outskirts of Thebes in the middle of the 3rd century BC. Every morning he gets up before sunrise, washes his face with cold water from a clay jar, and places a tattered piece of cloth on his head to protect him from the glare of the day. He doesn't have a name preserved in the papyri, but life is engraved in his hands, in the sores, in the broken nails, in the traces of ropes on his shoulders. Bricks aren't made automatically. Clay is mixed with straw, kneaded with the feet, pressed into wooden molds, left in the sun for days, then carried, piled up, and moved dozens of times. There's no rest, no shade, except for a few minutes when the breeze creeps in from the distant river. Does he have dreams? Perhaps he dreamed of a wife like the girl who sells grain in the market. Perhaps he wished for a house of stone whose walls wouldn't melt every winter. Perhaps he didn't dream of anything. Perhaps his body was too tired to dream, and when he got sick, no doctor visited him. His mother smeared a paste of dates and ash on his forehead. His sister put a small amulet under his pillow. He was left to recover or not. But despite all this, he sometimes laughed. He stole 2 dates from a storeroom. He sang a song his mother heard in the temples. He shared a cup of diluted beer with his companions in the evening. Joy is not a luxury, but a silent resistance. And he wasn't alone. Tens of hundreds of thousands lived his life without names, without hymns. But the bricks they made are still there in the walls of cities, in the foundations of temples, in the silence of history. And when he died, no tomb was inscribed for him. Perhaps he was buried in a small hole by the river. Perhaps everyone forgot him after months. But every brick in ancient Egypt tells of people like him. These are the ones who built what we think is eternal. And while we talk about kings, they remain the silent witness. The class that paid the price of immortality with its sweat, silence, and unfulfilled dreams in ancient Egypt. The writer was a central figure, not necessarily a literary writer, but an official employee who was skilled at drawing letters, knew arithmetic, and held a pen as others held a trowel or chisel. The writer saw the world from above, not because of narcissism, but because his position was actually higher than the ground, as he sat on a clean mat holding a papyrus scroll, while the farmer stood in the mud under the sun. Imagine a writer in his 40s working in the grain storehouse department in one of the administrative cities. His face was calm, his clothes simple but clean, and his hands bore no traces of manual labor, but rather stains of black and red ink. His job was not as simple as it seemed. He calculated what went into the storehouse and what went out, documented the quantities, the names of the recipients, the dates, and sometimes witnessed the exchanges. One mistake might mean a deduction from a farmer's salary, a suspicion of theft, or an investigation by a state inspector. The writer knew that he was being watched not only by his superiors, but by the gods, because justice, or mat, was the essence of the Egyptian system, and to make a mistake in your calculations meant that abandoning balance not only in documents but in the universe itself. Writing was not a simple tool. It was a privilege to learn, requiring years of training, imitating letters, repeating exercises, and understanding complex symbols that could mean one thing and its opposite depending on the context. Therefore, the writer was treated with some respect and sometimes with some fear because he possessed a weapon that did not see the word. However, the writer was not always wealthy. Some of them lived a simple life, lived in modest homes, and raised their children like any worker. But the difference is that his voice remained. His name was written, and perhaps thanks to papyrus, we do not know now how he thought, complained, or mocked his boss. In one of the satirical texts, a young writer writes to his friend, "Writing is better than farming. In farming, your back breaks, but in writing, you sit and send someone who tires you out. But the truth is that the pen may be light on the hand, but it is heavy on the conscience." The writer in ancient Egypt was not just a transmitter. He was a guardian of knowledge and a witness to daily details that did not remain in memory, but in ink. On the edges of the desert, where the shadow of the trees ends and the sand begins, graves were created. Some of them are simple, no more than a hole covered with stone, and some of them are complex, carved into the heart of the mountain, decorated with walls filled with drawings and texts. But behind these majestic funerary buildings, there was an army of men, engravers, painters, sculptors, engravers, and transport workers, living and working in a semi-enclosed area called Deir el-Medina. These were not slaves, but skilled craftsmen who mastered the secrets of the art and knew the fine details of the religion, the names of the gods, and the rituals that must be painted on the walls of the tombs to work in the afterlife. But work in the tombs was not always spiritual. It was hard, continuous, and in a difficult environment. The mountains were hard, the tools were primitive, the dust was thick, and the heat was unforgiving. Imagine yourself as an artist, engraving scenes you have never seen. Green lands in the fields of Iro, gods with bird heads, the sun boat, mummification rituals. You do not know if this is real, but you carry it out with inner faith, or perhaps only with the precision of the craft. Perhaps you do not know that the one you work for, the nobleman or the prince, may never visit you. Nevertheless, the engravings must be perfect, because one defect could be considered a spiritual defect, and there may be consequences. Although this group enjoyed some appreciation, discipline was they were harsh. They had to adhere to strict schedules and report any absence or negligence and were monitored by officials who even recorded the amount of clay used. But they were also human beings. We know from their documents that they quarreled, fought, fell in love, sometimes stole, conspired, lied, and spoke about their superiors in secret. Some of them even recorded their dreams, thoughts, and letters to their loved ones. They lived on the bus between daily life and the symbolic death they worked for, between a tiring reality and a belief that promised immortality. They left their mark not only on the walls of the tombs but also in the papyri and in their tools and in those moments that tell us that history was never silent. At the heart of daily life in ancient Egypt, the family was the foundation. The father worked, the mother ran the home, and the children learned through observation, assistance, and repetition. There was no concept of childhood as we know it today. The child was considered a working member as soon as he could carry or pull something. The small family often lived next to the extended family, the grandfather, the uncle, and the wife. The second is sometimes in one space or in adjacent houses, and there are no private rooms in the modern sense. Everyone sleeps in the same place, eats from the same vessel, and breathes the same air. In the evening, oil lamps are lit and stories are told about kings, about gods, about talking animals, and about men who disappeared in the desert and returned after years changed. Stories were a means of understanding the world, a means of resisting fear and of feeling in control of the unknown. But fear was always present. Fear of disease, of unexpected floods, of the wrath of the gods, of the injustice of scribes, of wars that might erupt far away and then come closer. Therefore, the gods were everywhere. Small amulets hung around necks, buried in walls or drawn on tools. There was an inner belief that the universe is fragile and that it is in constant need of balance, correction, and prayer. Not every prayer is said out loud. Many of them are said in silence, in a touch on a statue, in a candle lit in a small corner of the house, in a sigh after a simple meal. But despite all this presence of the gods, there was an inner feeling of silence, a void that cannot be called a void between what is said and what is felt, between the texts that are prepared. With protection and reality that does not always protect the farmer who is lost because of rats, the woman who miscarries for the third time, the child who does not wake up in the morning, they all raise their eyes to the sky not with questions but with patience. Life was like an incomplete fabric. Every thread in it is woven with effort, and then suddenly breaks, but they return to the fabric every day as if they have lost nothing. The family, if it was not just a social unit, it was a refuge, a school. A small temple and a silent mirror that appears the unspeakable has become apparent. Despite the fatigue and hardship of daily life, there were moments when the fatigue was allowed to calm down a little and the spirit was allowed to emerge from the weight of the body. Moments of feasts. In ancient Egypt, feasts were not merely days of rest, but rather a mixture of worship, joy, and a celebration of belonging to an organized world ruled by both God and Pharaoh. Each temple had its own calendar. Each god had his rituals, and the most famous festivals were those associated with the Nile: the Flood Festival, the Opet Festival, and the New Year's Festival. On these occasions, cities would change. Imagine the city of Thebes, its streets filled with music, flowers, and incense. Priests would walk in their white clothes, carrying small statues of the gods in portable boats, crossing between the temples in a silent and profound procession. People would decorate their doors, cook rare foods, drink beer, laugh, exchange simple gifts, and on some occasions, women would even be allowed to go out to dance in the squares and sing in the sun. On these days, work would stop. The farmer would not plant, the writer would not record, and the letter would not carve. Everyone would participate in the celebration not just as a spectator, but as a participant in restoring the balance of the universe, as they believed. Because the ritual, in essence, was not just a celebration, but a renewal of a sacred contract between the people and the gods. Every detail of the celebration, from the decorations to the foods to the hymns, had a meaning and a role, but don't be fooled by the pictures. The festivals were not always joyful for everyone. Those who did not have anything to spend would feel the burden, and those who died for them would feel the burden. A relative who does not participate, and those who work in the service of the celebrations may be more tired than any other day, and yet these days had a special magic. It was a moment that allowed people to forget a little or remember something different, to laugh without fear, to hope without conditions. The holidays were also an occasion to tell stories, pass on myths, and connect the new generation with the wisdom of the ancients. It was a moment in which the differences between rich and poor, between slave and free, between those in the palace and those under the sun, melted away. Perhaps it was the way people resisted time to create moments, however brief, whose quantity was not determined by effort, but by hymns. In a world without antibiotics, cameras, or even an accurate understanding of the causes of infection, disease in ancient Egypt was a part of daily life, but also something of a mystery. It was seen not only as a biological phenomenon, but as an imbalance, a sign of divine wrath, or a signal from an unseen world. Imagine a middle-aged man working as a stonemason to build a temple wall. He wakes up one morning with a fever burning his skin. No doctor comes to him, but his wife boils him an infusion of marjoram or cinnamon or the roots of a plant said to ward off evil spirits. Spells were read over it. Amulets of blue faience were placed on his chest. The Ankh symbol, the key to life, was drawn on his body, perhaps containing remnants of healing. If the illness became severe, he was taken to a priest-physician who combined medical knowledge with spells. He examined the eyes, smelled the breath, touched the skin, and then wrote a prescription on papyrus or described a ritual method for healing. However, most people did not reach this point. Healing from illness was mostly a domestic and random affair. If a person died, he was buried in the nearest possible place and a small statue was given to him so that he could work on his behalf in the afterlife, if there was someone who could do that. What is interesting is that the ancient Egyptians were not desperate. They were aware of their fragility, yes, but they did not surrender to it without prescriptions and without experiments. They left texts on how to treat headaches, eye pain, fractures, and even gynecological diseases. Texts such as the Ebers and Smith Papyrus reveal extensive knowledge, but they also reveal a constant anxiety about the feeling that the body is weak and that the world, despite its beauty, is full of unpleasant surprises. The Egyptians linked illness and behavior. You lied a lot, you might get a swollen tongue. If you stole, you might get a disability in your hand. The body was not separate from morals, but a mirror to them. But even when the body collapsed, there was hope that after that you would recover. There would be a return to being young, that you would be resurrected without pain. When the house loses a member, it does not collapse. Life goes on simply because there is no other choice. The patient goes and the harvest does not wait. In ancient Egypt, water was not just a natural element. It was everything. The Nile, with its great artery, was the heart that pumped life to the ends of the earth. At the same time, it could be a source of anxiety and a measure of people's life or death. Imagine the beginning of summer when the river begins to slowly rise. Every eye turns towards it. Every house, every field, every scribe in the temples awaits the sign. When will it end? Because a good flood meant fertility, a good season, and an abundant harvest. A weak or devastating flood meant hunger or even death. There was a precise system for measuring the Nile, known as the Nile measurement. Dotted stone pillars were placed in specific locations to measure the water level. The scribes carefully recorded these values because they determined taxes and decided much of the year's fate. But water was not only in the river. It was in the houses, carried in heavy clay jars. Every morning, women and girls would go to the edge of the canals, fill the jars and count them over their heads, walking with measured steps to test their balance. Because any fall meant the beginning of a new day of fatigue, the water was kept in clay vessels inside the houses, cooled by evaporation and covered with a piece of cloth because flies were merciless. In the villages, there were no sewage canals. Water was used with caution and reused several times. Despite all this, cleanliness was a central value. The ancient Egyptian would wash daily if he could, and purify himself before entering the temples. He was careful to keep his body clean as he was careful to keep his clothes clean. Because water was pure, it was associated with the goddess Hathor and with the goddess Nun, the symbol of the beginning. Even the creation of the world, in their imaginations, began from a primitive watery ocean. However, they were afraid because water carries, like the Nile flood, the possibility of drowning, the possibility of disease, and the possibility of collapse. Therefore, they built the villages a little higher than the level of the river. The flood and created a system of dams and canals that they managed with calculations as if every drop had a mind. Water in ancient Egypt was not something to be taken for granted. It was a blessing to be protected and an obsession that never faded. Every morning when the first jar was scooped up, it was a silent prayer said to the soul that the water would continue and that life would continue. When we look today at the temples of Karnak or Luxor, we are amazed by their size, the precision of their columns, and the vastness of their courtyards. We forget that in their time they were not archaeological ruins, but rather living, vibrant institutions that greatly influenced the life of every Egyptian. The temple in ancient Egypt was not only a place for prayer or devotion, but it was an economic apparatus, a scientific reference, a house of justice, and sometimes a center for treatment. It was the largest employer in the country after the royal palace. Imagine a temple like Ammonius Ra in Thebes. Dozens of priests, hundreds of workers, sculptors, bakers, scribes, guards, cleaners, and assistants from every class. People do not enter the Holy of Holies, but stand outside, seeing the processions of the gods and hearing the hymns. From afar, the temple is a place for the gods, not for people. Daily sacrifices are not offered once a week, but 3 times a day. The statue is washed, dressed, perfumed, and offered more varied foods than any peasant could dream of. Bread, fruit, oils, beer, honey, and even rare meats, all of which are devoutly carried. But the god does not eat, but the priests. What is offered to the god is then distributed to the workers according to a complex system that ensures justice, or assumes it. The priests had ranks just like military personnel. No one would shake hands with the first priest, and the 5th priest might work more in cleaning than in rituals. But each one of them knew that this stone on which he stood, these porticos, these engraved walls, were more precious than any human house. No one had a ceiling of this precision, a wall of this strength, or a door of this height. Therefore, working in the temple was an honor and a danger. If you made a mistake, the punishment was not only worldly, but eternal. If you stole something small, a piece of cloth, dates, or oil, you could be cursed in this world and not be resurrected in the next. It was natural for people to feel awe of the temple. It was a mass of symbols. To pass by it while you are hungry, and you see the food entering it, it has an unforgettable effect. And with all this, there was no rebellion. There was respect, sometimes restlessness, and sometimes a silent prayer that the scales would one day level out. Because as an ancient Egyptian citizen, you know that the temple of the god does not fall, but your body falls every day. At the end of the day, when the sun begins to descend behind the river, everything changes. The voices calm down, the bodies slow down, and the old city takes on another character, closer to tranquility and closer to contemplation, even if no one calls it that. The return from the fields or from the workshops or from the temple means a new crossing. From the world of work to the world of home, and home, no matter how simple, becomes your entire world for a few hours. The smell of hot bread, fried onions, or meat simmering on the fire fills the place before you reach it. There, on the clay floor, everyone gathers around one plate, eating with their hands, talking or remaining silent. There aren't many candles, 1 or 2 oil lamps illuminating faces with a soft yellow glow. Children sleep in the corner, wrapped in coarse cloths, whispering before they disappear. As for the adults, they may not sleep quickly because the night, despite its quiet, carries the weight of its own scarcity. The thoughts of the day don't disappear, but rather wait for someone whose wages are late, someone who heard a rumor about a search for someone who lost something. All of this revolves in the head like silent drum beats. But there are also moments of light. A woman singing to her son, a man fixing something broken, someone telling an old story about Snow Het who fled Egypt and then returned with dignity, or about Isis who gathered the remains of Osiris and made a new life out of them. The story is always bigger. From the present, it is a path to salvation, or at least a path to tranquility. Outside, the breeze begins to move. The air becomes a little cool. The sky takes on a dark blue color, and sounds gradually fade until you hear only distant footsteps or the sound of a dog barking in an unknown place. Inside, you feel that despite everything, you are part of a rhythm that does not stop. Tomorrow is a new day and it will begin again, from bread and from you. In ancient Egypt, childhood was not a long stage of play, but rather a stage of rapid transition towards production. From the age of 5 or 6, the child would begin to accompany his father to the fields, or watch his mother kneading, or learn from his older brother how to carry water without spilling it. Imagine a thin, barefoot child following the shadow of his father in the fields, holding a small stick with which he imitates the movement of digging or collecting sticks after pruning. No one tells him when he will become a man, but he knows that he will be considered one when he can work without being asked. There were no public schools for everyone, but there were scribal schools, which were reserved for the sons of the administrative class or those nominated by families to climb the social ladder. In these schools, there was the child learns hieroglyphics, arithmetic, and the art of silence in front of the teacher. The beginnings were harsh. Mistakes were punishable, repetition was endless, sitting for hours in silence, and the desire to play was suppressed. But the reward was the passage into the world of words, authority, and safe work within walls, not under the sun. Most children grew up directly within life, learning through repetition, trial, and error. A child observes how grains are ground, how oil is filtered, how cloth is patched, until she memorizes all the details without writing. Everyone was expected to contribute. Whoever did not work became a burden. Even entertainment, if it existed, was part of the cycle of life. Playing with sticks, making clay shapes, imitating adults, not with manufactured toys. There were small moments of fun, dancing, music, swimming in the river, group games similar to wrestling or jumping, songs sung by grandmothers in the evening. But it was not a childhood life, but a life of preparation. With the passage of time, the young man or woman becomes ready to work, to marry, to fully integrate into society. No one tells them that life begins now because it began a long time ago, when the first pot was carried or the first handful of wheat was ground in ancient Egypt. Work is not just a means of living, but a duty imposed from the moment one is able to stand. You didn't ask questions like what would you like to do, but rather what could you do and what do others need from you. The Egyptian state in its time was one of the most organized systems of government. Everything was recorded. Crops, the number of heads of livestock, wages, days of absence, building materials, and even the amount of dust at work sites. Imagine yourself as a simple employee in a government pottery workshop. You start your day by moistening the clay, then shaping the pots, leaving them to dry, then transporting them, then reshaping them if they are broken or not approved. All of this is under the supervision of an official who records every movement and demands an explanation if you are late or fail. As for those who work in agriculture, their season is not in their hands. The river is the master, and the flood is the decider. When the harvest season begins, every able man and boy is summoned, whether his land is his own or not, because harvesting is a national, not a private, task. The carpenter, the blacksmith, the builder, they are all subject to the supervision of the state or the temple. They may suddenly be asked to move to a new project in another city, to build a wall, pave a road, or dig a canal. Refusal is a club, because refusal could mean punishment or doubt about loyalty. However, the work was not always coercive. There was an aspect of pride in it, in specialization and skill. The man who masters stone carving is known for that. The woman who made the softest fabrics was asked for by name. He kept short biographies of some workers, small inscriptions that reminded them that they were precise, loyal, and never delayed, even in a world that did not award prizes. There was a value in efficiency. It is worth noting that the Egyptians did not separate work from worship. Every effort made with perfection was an approach to the gods. Every pottery jar that was tightly sealed, every piece of wood that was fitted with care, was a kind of purity. Therefore, when you work, you do not work only for yourself or even for your family, but you work to keep the universe in balance, to protect Ma'at. Therefore, work in ancient Egypt was not just a physical effort, but a continuous ritual and a permanent struggle against chaos. In ancient Egypt, the state and religion were not two separate spheres, but rather two sides of the same coin. The pharaoh was not only a political ruler, but the son of the god, the representative of the gods on earth and the guarantor of the stability of the universe. But what does this mean for the ordinary person, the peasant who does not see the pharaoh and does not enter the temple except from the outside? How did he interact with this authority that is invisible but governs everything? Imagine a simple man working in a field that he does not own, and he is asked. He paid part of the crop each season as a tax. He did not go himself, but the tax collectors would come, weigh, write, and take. If he objected, he might be punished, and if he hid something, his house might be searched. However, despite this, the relationship was not hostile. Rather, there was a kind of acceptance, of contentment, of surrender that this is how the world is and that the pharaoh works for the benefit of all, or so he was told. Religion reinforced this feeling of universal justice, or Ma'at must be preserved, and any deviation from the system is considered a threat to the universe itself. Therefore, when the farmer speaks about injustice, he does so with caution. There is a famous papyrus known as the Complaints of the Eloquent Farmer, in which a simple man wrote a series of letters complaining about a corrupt official who stole his crops. However, what is striking is that he did not curse the official, but rather used an eloquent style, pleading with justice and truth. He knew that he could not break the system, but he could remind people of it. In return, the state was not deaf. There were reviews, and sometimes the corrupt were punished. The priests recorded, and the scribes documented, and everything was preserved, at least on paper. However, the simple man remained in the shadows, asked to work and pray. He was afraid to be silent, yet he found a way out in little charms, in folk songs, in satirical tales, in passing humor, in the names of gods that he repeated when he could find no others. He had no power, but he was not unconscious. He knew that justice was not always just, but it was necessary, and that was why he stood his ground. Working, praying, and breathing quietly between the pharaoh and the plow in ancient Egypt, women were not completely marginalized beings, nor were they the center of life as we like to imagine. Rather, they were strongly present in daily life, but in many cases, they were absent from official texts, as if they bore the burden of life without being written about. Women were wives, bakers, singers, priestesses, and even owners of rare land, but they were also workers at home, in the fields, and in the weaving workshops. They toiled with the man, giving birth, raising, teaching, and resisting. Imagine a woman in her 30s working in a small weaving workshop inside the temple, threading the threads into the loom, raising and lowering the wooden sticks, pulling the threads, and readying the water. She sits for long hours in the stifling heat, the red color seeping into her fingertips. She does not write her name on the fabric, but the fabrics she weaves are exported, given away, and used in priesthood, burials, and marriages. She is present in all these moments, even if she is not mentioned. In the home, women were the center, preparing food, organizing the affairs of the day, treating the sick, raising children, memorizing stories, and teaching them how to deal with the world, and she had the right to inheritance in buying and selling and sometimes in legal testimony, but all of this was not always easy or fair. She always had to prove that she was worthy and that she was accepted and that she was not a burden. In some texts we hear women's voices, complaints, prayers, or even love songs in which a girl describes her lover as closer than the Nile breeze or lighter than the shade of a lotus tree. But we also hear silence. Many women whose names, faces, or even graves we do not know. They lived, gave birth, and died in silence. Nevertheless, the ancient Egyptian woman knew her value even if the priests did not recognize her. She protected her home, treated with herbs, new amulets, and red faces. In the moments of birth or death, she was the first to be called because in the end she held on to life from both ends, not by authority, but by a touch, not by a name, but by an action. In the modern imagination, when we imagine a house in ancient Egypt, we might imagine stone walls, drawings on the walls, and perhaps a spacious courtyard, but the reality was simpler and more fragile. The houses of the common people were built from raw bricks are a mixture of clay and straw, dried in the sun, easy to shape and easy to collapse. Imagine a small house in a suburb of Memphis or Thebes. 1 or 2 rooms with a low roof and a roof of palm fronds, and an uneven floor sometimes covered with straw mats. No locked doors, but rather thick curtains or planks supported by stones. No glass windows, but small openings for ventilation and often for dust. The house is not for rest, but for protection from the sun, from the wind, from the glances of strangers. Therefore, it is always a little dark, a little damp, a little sluggish, as if it were resting with its owners. Inside you find clay pots lined up in one corner, water jugs, food bowls, small stoves, a pot for cooking, and a basket for the husks. In the other corner, the sleeping place, stuffed mats or fabrics, and perhaps a coarse quilt, if there is one. Life here revolves in a specific circle. The day is outside, work, selling, the fields. The night is inside, cooking, stories, and perhaps singing. The woman cleans, arranges, and reshapes the space as needed. The man repairs the roof if it leaks. Rain changes the place of the mat or throws away the cracked wall, and children scribble in the mud. Making toys from straw, running in the corridors, and hearing the adults talking about things they don't yet understand. Despite its simplicity, the house had its sanctity. Whoever entered it had to be invited, and whoever lived in it knew that there was something in it that shouldn't be said outside. And if the house collapsed, as sometimes happens because of flooding or time, no one screamed, but the cycle was repeated. The mud was gathered and shaped again, the building was rebuilt, and life returned. The house was not a wall, but a continuity. It was the memory, the hiding place, and the only place that didn't need. Its owner has to prove something there. You can be silent without asking why. In ancient Egypt, food was not just a biological need but part of the rhythm of life, and its symbolism, what is eaten and how it is prepared and when it is served, carried meanings that go beyond hunger and satiety. The basic food was bread, as mentioned before, but it was not one type. It was prepared in different shapes and sizes, sometimes stuffed with legumes or dates or smeared with oil. And beer was a type of beer made from barley. It was the daily drink even for children because it is more nutritious and safer than water. Sometimes imagine a lady in the middle of the day preparing a meal for her family. She starts by grinding barley on a flat stone, then kneading the flour with water and salt and maybe some onions or dried coriander. Then she puts it in a hot clay oven, and in a pottery pot she boils vegetables, beans, lentils, onions, or plants gathered from the neighboring fields. Meat is rare. It is eaten on holidays, or when the family slaughters a chicken or waterfowl or buys a small piece from the market. And the fruits were seasonal: figs, grapes, pomegranates, dates, dried, sometimes to be preserved and mixed with honey or used in rituals. But what is striking is that food was not only for living, but also for death. Pots filled with food were placed in tombs to accompany the deceased in the afterlife. The amulets buried with him were in the form of bread, fish, or cups of beer. In the texts, we find prayers that begin with a request for 100 loaves of bread, a cup of beer, a piece of roast meat, and a disc of figs, all symbols of abundance and reassurance after death. Food has a direct relationship with status. The priests ate special food that required a certain purification. The pharaoh had a full kitchen in the palace, countless servants, and rituals for tasting before the morsel reached him. But in the homes of the common people, eating meant sharing. It meant breaking bread with someone, drinking beer from a shared cup, or passing a piece of fruit to the youngest child. There was something called the silent meal, in which people ate without speaking, perhaps out of respect, fatigue, or ritual. Food, if it wasn't just what was put in the mouth, was a moment that defined who you were and with who and where do you go after eating, even after death. In a world mostly illiterate, writing was a special ability restricted to the few. Therefore, written words were treated as if they were living creatures born from the hand and remaining immortal on stone or papyrus, stronger than the wind and death. The writer in ancient Egypt was not just a transmitter of information, but a keeper of memory, a maker of power, and a copyist of life as it was intended to be seen, not exactly as it was. Imagine a small room with papyrus-covered walls and the writer's tools carefully arranged. A reed brush, an inkwell with red and black ink, a box that kept the ancient papyri, and a mind occupied with all the details of dictation, arrangement, and symbolism. Writing was not alphabetical, but rather complex symbolism that required long training and continuous patience. It is said that a trainee might spend years just learning to copy the names of the gods or formulate propaganda phrases before he was allowed to write a single official document. However, writing was not neutral. The writer chose what to write and to whom, and whoever is not mentioned is recorded in the records as if he did not exist. Therefore, writing was a tool of power and a tool of forgetting as well. Ordinary people who were not good at writing relied on memory, oral storytelling, and symbols on the walls of temples, but they were not silent. Rather, they found their ways to leave a mark. A drawing on the wall of a house, an inscription on a teapot, drawn on the edge of a papyrus as if it were a joke or a prayer engraved on a broken piece of pottery. Sometimes the writer uses his language against injustice, as in the story of the eloquent peasant, or in texts in which he hints at corruption or reflects tension, while it is supposed to be and what is writing if it is sometimes a space of resistance and a space of falsification. Other times, it is the ones that immortalize the names of kings and forget the names of the gravedigers. It writes contracts and denies broken covenants, but despite all that, it reveals something deep. Even when a person is submissive, he wants to be told about to be told. It was here that someone would write one day what he could not write about himself. Thus, silence in ancient Egypt sometimes became heavier than speech, and writing became a hidden sacred act between man and immortality. In ancient Egypt, death was not an end, but rather a transition, preparation, and a test. Life was not relatively short, paving the way for what is greater and more lasting, the afterlife. Therefore, no one lived without thinking about his death. The peasant, the scribe, the priest, even the child. They all grew up in the shadow of the cemeteries and were accustomed to seeing funeral processions, offerings, and amulets. This was not terrifying, but rather a kind of silent certainty. Imagine a simple funeral for a poor man carried on a wooden stretcher covered with an ordinary piece of cloth, followed by his children carrying small amulets and repeating the prayers they memorized from their fathers. No music, no, only loud crying, steps on the sand, and the sound of the wind. The man is buried in a simple hole, covered with dirt, and some food is placed at his head, a bottle of water, and a piece of pottery with his name written on it. Perhaps this was all he owned, but according to his faith, he had a chance to be resurrected, to be held accountable, to enter the fields of Iera, where the fields are green and inexhaustible, work is light, and food is endless. But entering this eternal life was not guaranteed. It was necessary to pass through the court of death, where the deceased stood before the god Osiris, and his heart was weighed in the scales of justice against his feathers. Unless his heart was light, that is, honest and truthful, who had not killed, stolen, or lied, he was allowed to cross. But if his heart was heavy, he was devoured by a creature with the head of a crocodile, and he no longer existed. This faith created a society that loves order, fears lying, and tries, even in its misery, to stay close to what is considered justice. Death, if it is not a collapse, is a moment of evaluation. Therefore, people were keen to prepare their graves early, to save up for them, and to write their name clearly on the they buried the amulets with them and taught their children how to pray for them after their death. The woman used to pray for her husband at night in a low voice that Osiris would have mercy on him and find him a place in the shade. Even those who were not buried in the tombs, whose names were eaten away and whose bones melted into the earth, even they believed that they would be resurrected because the gods do not forget, nor does the desert. For thousands of years, symbols and images were engraved on the walls of temples and tombs in ancient Egypt. They were not just decorations, but a complete, precise, and sacred language. Hieroglyphics were not ordinary writing, but rather a gateway between this world and the next world, used for prayer, to document threats and hope. But something strange happened, despite all this effort. The keys to this language were lost for centuries. The walls of the temples became a mystery. The words became silent drawings that visitors stare at without understanding. Imagine that you are standing in front of a wall in a temple in Luxor. You see the god Thoth writing on a piece of paper. You see the pharaoh offering sacrifices. You see birds, snakes, and the sacred eye, but you do not know what is really happening, as if you are reading a novel without knowing the alphabet until the Rosetta Stone came. This stone was engraved in the time of Ptolemy, and it carried the same text in 3 languages: hieroglyphic, Demotic, and Greek. This repetition was used as a bridge to decipher the mysteries. Jean-François Champollion came, and after years of study, failure, and retrying, he understood a simple thing: that hieroglyphics are not just symbolic representations, but rather have the sound of a system and calculations. Thus, the language began to speak again. But did he understand everything? No, many of the inscriptions are still unclear or loaded with high symbolism. Words that refer to lost concepts, linguistic structures that we do not know how to pronounce exactly, and most importantly, even when we read the meaning, the literal meaning remains hidden because this language was written from a religious, ritualistic, and philosophical perspective, and even from a completely different perspective of life today. A researcher can translate a text from the Temple of Edfu and say, "Here he writes about the creation of the world." But what creation? What world? Were those symbols merely an imagination or an inner truth whose keys we do not yet have? Hieroglyphic writing is not only a means of communication, but it is in itself one of the greatest mysteries of ancient Egypt. A mystery that has been partially revealed and still whispers in a language that only those who listen very slowly can hear. In ancient Egypt, cemeteries were not silent places as we see them today. Rather, they were vital spaces full of meanings, symbols, and preparation for the afterlife. But the cemeteries were not uniform. They varied greatly between the simple graves of the common people dug in the sand and the tombs of the nobles or pharaohs dug in the rocks and decorated with walls of stories and pictures. Imagine opening an ancient tomb that has not been touched for more than 3,000 years. The air that enters it is the first outside air to reach it since the walls were closed, filled with inscriptions, with a jackal's head, another with a falcon's head, and twisted texts that speak of ships, of tests, of immortal fields, and of enemies that must be crushed after death. But the question that is still being asked spiritually to this day is all this understood as it should be? Many of the tombs were engraved with wonderful decorations and colors, but they did not bear the name of their owner. Some of them had mysterious formulas written on them that were not repeated in other temples. There are even tombs with inscriptions that seem to have been reused or copied from other tombs. In some cases, we find beautiful ones that do not belong in the place where the person was buried, as if they were public copies sold to whoever had money. Then there are the buried amulets, small statues, the Eye of Horus, the Jed Pillar, and the Feather of Mot. Were they just symbols, or did each one of them represent a real key to a secret ritual? In the Valley of the Kings, where the pharaohs were buried, we find tombs like labyrinths of rooms after rooms, long corridors, walls covered with scenes of the afterlife. But why all this complexity? Was the purpose protection from thieves? Or is it a real map of the journey after death? In rare cases, we find them incomplete. The workers suddenly left the place or did not complete the decoration. Did the owner of the tomb die before it was completed? Or is there something wrong that we do not know? Even the small tombs were carefully surrounded, and some of them had people buried in them. Poor, but with them were small statues called Ushabti, statues that were supposed to work for them in the other world. The mysteries of the tombs, then, are not only in what was engraved, but also in what was not written in the closed doors, in the empty rooms, in the repeated symbols that were not explained. They are mysteries that are not completely solved, but rather they are next to us as if they are saying what they know. Not everything that was in the big cities and in the remote outskirts. The Egyptian temples were built as huge, towering buildings, as if they did not belong to this world. But these buildings were not only for prayer or decoration, but rather they were small worlds containing a special system, laws, secrets, and roles that were not easily understood. Each temple was a miniature universe extending from a huge gate guarded by statues to courtyards flooded with light, then corridors that grew darker the closer they got to the heart of the temple, where the Holy of Holies was located, the small room that only one priest entered, and in which the statue of the god was hidden. But what happened inside these closed spaces? The priests did not record everything. The major rituals, such as those performed at the Ope Festival or the rituals of renewal of life, we know about them, of drawings and engravings, but their precise details, hand movements, spoken words, and specific times remained secret. Some rituals were only performed at certain times of the year and were attended by a very small number of priests, sometimes in complete isolation. The rituals of washing and embalming, the symbolic mummification of statues, and moving them from one room to another, all of that IT was like a silent theater surrounded by fear, reverence, and possibility. Under the temple was something else. Secret passages, buried rooms, sound channels, mechanisms that moved doors or made sounds when the wind passed. Things that today seem like architectural tricks, but were used to arouse the visitors' awe or to confirm the power of the gods. Some temples contained medical, astronomical, and even educational inscriptions. The walls of the Temple of Edfu, for example, bear texts about the creation of the world, the secrets of the universe, and even about magical weapons against the forces of chaos. We do not know for sure whether these texts are symbolic or were they treated as scientific facts. There are also architectural mysteries. Temples built with amazing precision, aligned with specific solar or stellar positions. The Temple of Abu Simbel, for example, was designed so that the sun would illuminate the face of the statue of Ramses on only 2 specific days of the year. How did they do that? Why, even today, when we enter an Egyptian temple, we feel something we cannot call awe or silence. The walls themselves still preserve secrets. The temples were not only places of worship, but they were centers of knowledge. And for the intentional forgetting, because what was not written was perhaps the most important in a world full of the unknown. With fear of disease, floods, poverty, and death, people needed something to hold, something small and tangible that could be carried in the hand or hung around the neck. Hope itself became a material thing. These are the amulets in ancient Egypt. Amulets of blue faience, of gold, of precious stones, or ordinary clay. Sometimes they took the form of the Eye of Horus, the scarab beetle, the feather of Mot, the jed pillar, the mendug necklace, or the noose of life. Each one of them was not just an ornament, but was born from belief and anxiety. Imagine a mother placing a small amulet around the neck of her newborn child. It is not just a bead, but an invisible shield that protects him from evil spirits, from envy, from diseases that he does not understand, from the long night from which he cannot complain. The priests made the amulets carefully, reciting spells over them and purifying them with water, oil, and incense. It is said that some amulets did not work unless the correct words were spoken over them. People carried them with them to work. From the market to the field and in the cemeteries, they were sometimes buried with them by the dozens, distributed throughout the body, each one in its designated place near the heart, on the forehead, under the foot, and some amulets were made according to the moment of birth, when sick, when traveling, or when feeling danger. But what is striking is that everyone owned an amulet, rich or poor. Perhaps the materials differed, but the idea was the same. There is something invisible that must be appeased. Entire texts were written explaining the role of each amulet, when to wear it, and what it does, as if you were reading a treatment prescription or a plan to escape from the unknown. Although times have changed, the idea remained that a person hangs something small on his body, not because it is beautiful, but because it reassures him. The amulet, in the end, is not a piece of stone, but a hidden admission that we do not have control and that some hope is worn. Perhaps nothing in ancient Egypt arouses people's curiosity today as mummies do. Preserved bodies wrapped in layers of linen, faces covered with masks, and sometimes with glass eyes as if they were looking at you from an immeasurable distance in time. But why all this effort? What was... The Egyptians believed it was so important to the body that they needed to preserve it with such precision. The answer is not one. Death, in their view, was not a break, but a crossing. However, the crossing has conditions, the most important of which is that the soul recognizes the body upon resurrection. If the body is corrupted, the soul is lost, and if the soul is lost, the person is lost forever. Therefore, the mummification process appeared, with complex rituals that begin by emptying the body of its organs, then drying it with salt, then wrapping it in layers between which texts are sometimes written, or amulets are placed in them, or special oil is sprinkled over it. Then the body is placed in a coffin, often made of wood or stone, covered with inscriptions and prayers. But strangely, mummies differ greatly in their level. A royal mummy might be wrapped in soft fabrics decorated with gold, preserved in 4 coffins inside each other, with a mask of gold inlaid with precious stones on its face. As for the mummy of a peasant, it might be a naturally dried body wrapped in old rags, buried in a shallow hole without writing or amulets. Despite that, both mummies belong to the same dream: to be resurrected, to remember, not to be erased. Today, when we open a coffin that is 3,000 years old, and we find in it a body with its skin, its hair, its teeth, we feel something deep, awe-inspiring, not because the body is frightening, but because it is still here. But who is he? What was he thinking? Did he choose what was written on his shroud? Did he really believe that he would rise one day? Many questions can only be answered by silence and the stigma of the mummy. It is as if he is telling us, "Look, this is all that remains, do not waste it." In the nights of the Egyptian desert, when the sun sets, the sky is revealed in all its vastness, and the stars appear as we do not see them today, clear and dense, dancing in the silence. In this vastness, the ancient Egyptian saw more than beauty. He saw order. Astronomy was not an abstract science, but a part of daily life, rituals, and management. The stars were used to calculate time, to determine the agricultural seasons, the dates of holidays, and even to choose sacred sites. The most famous star was Sopit, what we know today as the Imani star. Its appearance with dawn on a certain day of the year announced the beginning of the flood. This event, linked to the waters of the Nile, was a moment of life for which sacrifices were prepared, and a complete calendar was calculated based on it. Imagine a priest standing on the roof of a temple on a clear night, watching the movement of the stars. Recording it compares and perhaps foretells not astrology in its popular sense, but a feeling that the whole universe is connected and that the sky is not as far away as we think. Rather, some temples were built in alignment with a specific star or constellation. In the Dendra temple, on the ceiling we find a complex astronomical map showing the constellations, planets, and phases of the moon. Was it for decoration, ritual purposes, or precise calculations? We do not know. Ships sailed at night guided by specific stars. Even journeys in the other world, as the texts describe them, were directed by stars that guarded the souls and showed them the path to resurrection. Astronomy was not far from the calendar. The Egyptians divided the year into 12 months, each of 30 days, and 5 sacred days were added at the end of the year. All of this was done with precise calculations that were repeated and monitored because any error in calculating the time could lead to a defect in the weather, a shortcoming in worship, or a corruption in the harvest. Therefore, the stars were like hidden clocks that did not make mistakes and did not need to be repaired. Although the tools were simple, a stick, a rope, and a roof, the knowledge that came out of them was precise enough to build temples. It aligns with the sun on certain days, and after thousands of years, the ark is still working if it is not a luxury or a waste but a necessity. And another voice from the sky in ancient Egypt, the myth was not just a fantasy but a way to understand life and organize the chaos and explain what the eye cannot see. The question was not did this happen, but what does this mean? Take, for example, the myth of Osiris, the god who killed and tore his body apart his brother Set. Then his wife Isis gathered him and brought him back to life and gave birth to Horus, who took revenge for him. This is not just a story but the basis of their perception of death, resurrection, and justice. Every funeral, every prayer, Every amulet carries within it the threads of this story or contemplation of the story of Ra. The sun god who sails in a boat across the sky by day and then descends to the underworld at night and fights the serpent of darkness, Abu Fiz. Every dawn is a victory. Every sunset is the beginning of a new battle. These stories were not only told, but practiced by priests who acted them out in rituals. Artists drew them on walls. People told them to their children, not as a means of entertainment, but as an explanation, a reassurance, and perhaps a resistance. Myth was a means of giving shape to anxiety. Why do people die? Why does the Nile flood suddenly? Why is a child born sick? The answer is in the story. There are less famous but amazing myths, such as the story of the god of creation who cried and humans emerged from his tears, or the girl who turned into a palm tree to protect her village from the winds, or the book hidden in a cave that could only be opened by those who knew its real name. The names of the gods themselves were full of meaning. Thoth, the goddess of writing and wisdom. Batet, the cat goddess who protects the home and preys on danger. Sekhmet, the destructive lioness who only heals if told with blood or music. Legend, if it is not a story about others, but about you, about your fear, hope, patience, and memories that cannot find a language for it, is reality when reality is not enough. Despite thousands of years of excavation, translation, and study, most of the history of ancient Egypt is still lost. This is not an exaggeration, but a fact acknowledged by every archaeologist and every researcher. What we have of texts, statues, mummies, inscriptions, and papyri are nothing but fragments of remains preserved by chance or by miracle. How many temples were lost under the sand? How many papyri were burned? How many tombs were looted before anyone could reach them? How many stories were never written down at all? Imagine everything we do not know. The language of the common people, their proverbs, their jokes, their daily struggles, their chants in the fields, the details of birth, loss, jealousy, love. Imagine that all these things that form the heart of life are not written down, and even what we have we do not fully understand. Texts we read without knowing the rhythm in which they were said, drawings. We see it without knowing the class for which myths were drawn. We analyze it without knowing how they felt. There is something deeper than the material loss. There is the emotional loss. What did a writer feel when he copied the names of the gods for the 110th day? What did he feel when he engraved the face of the pharaoh, knowing that he himself would not be mentioned? We possess the form, but the essence is still hidden in the layers of silence. Nevertheless, the monuments of ancient Egypt remain pulsating, not because they are complete, but because they are incomplete. It is as if they call us not to understand everything, but to ask, and the question itself is perhaps the true survival in ancient Egypt. The palace was not just a beautiful building. It was a visual statement of power, wealth, and closeness to the gods. Only a few lived inside the palaces of the pharaoh. The high priests, some nobles, army leaders, and his scribes, very close to the decision-making center. And often the palaces were not only for housing, but to prove status. Imagine a palace on the bank of the Nile. Its walls are painted with white lime, its columns are colored, and its courtyards are filled with palm trees, flowers, and pools of water that reflect the sky. Inside, there are spacious rooms and smooth floors. The stone, soft linen bedspreads, and the invariable scent of incense. In a certain corner, there is a library where papyri are kept, records of correspondence, religious texts, and even personal spells. But more important than the palace itself is who passes through it. These elite, unlike the rest of the people, do not carry heavy jars, nor do their backs burn in the fields. Their clothes are softer, their nails are cleaner, and their speech is calmer. But their lives are not free of tension. Your proximity to the palace means your proximity to danger. A small mistake could lead to a fall from above, a reversal of balance, doubt of loyalty, a change in the pharaoh's mood, and a blessing could turn into a curse.